Part 1. The Outlaw's Confession, dark and intimate, on the eve of his hanging, when the last light slipped behind the low hills and the town of Dry Creek settled into a hush that felt like held breath, Elias Crow sat alone in the narrow room beneath the gallows, granted one final night by a sheriff who believed solitude was a kinder mercy than chains, and as the wind whispered through the beams above like a cautious witness, Elias leaned back against the cool wooden wall and began to speak, not to any person, for none were there, but to the night itself, to the dust and timber and the long memory of the land, confessing a secret no one had ever known, a truth that had lived inside him like a second heart. He spoke quietly at first, his voice roughened by years of silence, telling how the legend of Elias Crow had been built from moments taken out of time, from choices made when fear ran faster than reason, and how the stories told about him, the robberies, the gunfire, the merciless glare, were shadows cast by a single night that had never left him. A night when he was not yet an outlaw but a boy named Eli who believed the world could be gentle if handled with care. He remembered the smell of sage after rain, the way his mother hummed while mending shirts, the promise he made to himself to never become a man feared by children, and he laughed softly now at the memory, not bitterly but with a kind of sorrowed tenderness, because he knew how far he had traveled from that promise. The wind pressed closer, rattling the rope above, and Elias confessed that the first blood tied to his name had not been taken by his hand, that the tale of his cold aim was a lie born of panic when a deputy's horse stumbled and a shot meant for the sky found flesh instead, and in that chaos, the crowd decided what they needed him to be, and he had worn that need like a coat too heavy to remove. He admitted that fear can harden a man quicker than hate, that once the road narrowed, he chose to keep walking because turning back felt worse than the fall ahead, and as he spoke, the room seemed to listen, the boards holding his words as if they mattered. He told the night about the woman whose name he never said aloud, the one who had seen him before the legend did, whose eyes held both caution and hope, and how he had left her at a creek crossing at dawn because he believed his shadow would only darken her life, and how that leaving had followed him more faithfully than any posse. The confession deepened, becoming intimate and careful, as he described nights under wide stars when he guarded strangers without them knowing, how he paid for food he took, how he turned his horse away from towns that needed peace more than another name to fear, and he wondered aloud if goodness that goes unseen still counts, if mercy that leaves no mark can balance the scales, and the wind answered with a low sigh through the beams. Elias spoke of the moment he stopped running, not from weariness but from clarity, when he understood that legends grow when men stay silent, and that truth, even late, might loosen the knot around his name, and he said he accepted the rope not as punishment but as punctuation, a hard ending to a long sentence that needed to be finished cleanly. His voice softened as he admitted his greatest secret, that the night he was captured, he had the chance to flee but chose to stay because a child was crying in the dark and he could not leave without making sure the child was safe, and that choice, small and unseen, felt like returning a borrowed piece of his soul. He paused then, breath steady, listening to the town's distant creaks and the far call of an owl, and he confessed that he was afraid, not of dying, but of being remembered wrong, of becoming a story stripped of context, and he asked the empty room if truth could travel after a man is gone, if the land itself might remember his footsteps honestly. The wind lifted again, brushing the rope, and Elias smiled faintly, imagining the plains carrying his words like seeds, imagining someone someday finding a gentler version of his name and wondering if even outlaws can be made of ordinary hopes. He spoke until the night felt closer, until his voice grew tired and honest, until the legend loosened and the man remained, sitting beneath the gallows with a steady heart, having given the dark what it asked for, believing that confession, whispered to the west, might yet rewrite the story told by the dust. She arrived in Red Mesa at the hour when the desert heat finally loosened its grip, when the sun sank low enough to turn the sand the color of old copper and the town seemed to exhale after another punishing day, and from the moment her boots touched the wooden walk, the whispers began, because everyone knew the name Marabelle or thought they did, knew it the way people know storms from a distance, not by understanding them but by fearing what follows. She wore black not in mourning but in habit, plain dress faded by sun and travel, her dark hair pinned neatly as if order might keep the past at bay, and her eyes, quiet, watchful, tired, held no invitation, yet no man in Red Mesa could deny the pull of her presence, the strange gravity that followed her like a second shadow, because stories had reached this town long before she had, stories that said every outlaw who ever loved her met a violent end, that her name was written in blood across the territories, and though no one could say what crime she herself had committed, the men stepped aside as she passed, some tipping hats in respect, others crossing the street as if fate itself might brush against them. She rented the small adobe house at the edge of town, the one with a crooked fence and a lone mesquite tree, and kept to herself, buying supplies, speaking politely but briefly, never lingering long enough for questions to find her, and at night her lamp burned late, a soft glow against the endless dark. While the desert wind pressed against her windows like a restless memory, Mara had learned long ago that solitude was safer than hope, that love, once given, had a way of calling death closer, and so she lived carefully, tending a small garden that struggled against the dust, mending clothes for townsfolk who dared to knock, and sleeping lightly, always listening, because the West never truly slept. The first time she heard the sound outside her door that night, she thought it was the wind again, but then came the weight of a body against wood, a rough breath drawn through pain, and when she opened the door just enough to see, a wounded gunslinger collapsed at her feet, blood darkening his shirt, his face pale beneath the grime of travel, his revolver fallen from a nerveless hand, and in that moment, all the careful distance she had built cracked, because she recognized the look in his eyes even before he lost consciousness, the look of a man who had run out of road. She dragged him inside with strength born not of muscle but of necessity, locking the door behind them as if that might hold back the consequences, and as she cleaned the wound by lantern light, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest, she noticed the lines of his face, the wear of years lived fast and hard, the way his jaw clenched even in sleep as though bracing for another blow from the world. His name, she would later learn, was Thomas Hale, a gunslinger whose reputation followed him like dust, not infamous enough to be legend, but known well enough to have enemies, and as the night stretched long, Mara sat beside him, changing bandages, offering water when he woke briefly, their words few and careful, because both understood that questions carried weight and answers carried risk. Outside, the desert burned even in darkness, the air thick and unmoving, and inside, something fragile took shape, not love yet, but recognition, the quiet awareness of two people who had seen too much to believe easily. And when dawn came harsh and bright, Thomas was alive, and that alone felt like defiance. The town noticed quickly, of course, because Red Mesa noticed everything, and the whispers returned sharper than before, saying the widow had another man under her roof, that death would surely follow, and men who had once watched her with distant curiosity now watched with something closer to dread, as if the shadow they feared had finally taken form. Thomas healed slowly, each day gaining strength, each day lingering a little longer at the table, helping with small tasks once he could stand, and in the rhythm of shared silence, something began to soften in Mara, a feeling she had buried deep beneath grief and caution, because Thomas did not press her with promises or questions, did not speak of a future as if it were owed, but treated each day as something borrowed and therefore precious, and in return, Mara found herself speaking more than she intended, telling him about the places she had lived, the men she had loved, not their names but the way each had believed he could outrun his past, and how each had failed in different ways, leaving her with the same empty space. Thomas listened without judgment, his gaze steady, and when he spoke of himself, it was with the same careful honesty, admitting that he had chosen the gun because it was simpler than choosing forgiveness, that he had hurt people and been hurt in return, and that collapsing at her door felt less like bad luck and more like the world finally telling him to stop. Beneath the burning western sun, their days fell into a quiet pattern, broken only by the tension that hummed just below the surface, because both knew what the town believed, knew that love, if named, might invite the very end they feared, and yet the closeness grew, in small gestures, a shared cup of coffee at dawn, the way Thomas waited for her to sit before he ate, the way Mara's hand lingered a second longer when she passed him a plate, and the desert, indifferent and endless, bore witness. Trouble came the way it always does, riding in on horseback, in the form of men who recognized Thomas and brought with them the past he could not outrun, and when they stood in the street calling his name, the town held its breath, because everyone knew how these stories ended, and Mara felt the old fear rise, sharp and familiar, the certainty that loving him would mean losing him, that her presence marked men for the grave, and for a moment, she considered sending him away, choosing loneliness again as a kind of mercy. But Thomas, standing beside her in the doorway, did not reach for his gun, only took her hand, his grip steady, and said softly that running had never saved him before, that if fate wanted him, it would find him anywhere, and that staying here with her felt like the first honest choice he had made in years. The standoff ended without blood, the men riding away with threats and curses, perhaps deciding the cost was too high, perhaps believing the widow's curse would finish the work for them, and when the dust settled, the town exhaled, but the tension did not leave Mara's chest. because she knew survival did not mean safety, only delay. As days turned into weeks, love settled between them, not like fire but like heat stored in stone, slow and inevitable, and though they never spoke grand promises, never claimed forever, their connection deepened, shaped by shared understanding rather than illusion, and in quiet moments, Mara allowed herself to imagine a life not ruled by fear, a life where her name did not carry death with it. Tragedy, when it came, did not arrive with gunfire but with inevitability, because the West does not need drama to be cruel, only time. And when Thomas rode out one morning to settle unfinished business, promising to return by nightfall, Mara watched him go with a familiar ache, one she tried to ignore, and when he did not return, the town grew quiet again, the whispers turning solemn, resigned, as if the story had reached its expected end. They found him days later, not far from town, his body still, his face peaceful, as though he had finally laid his burdens down, and Mara stood alone beneath the wide sky, grief settling over her not like a scream but like sand, heavy and unyielding, and though the town would remember her as the widow whose lovers died, Mara knew a different truth, one the desert alone might keep, that love, even brief, even tragic, had given Thomas Hale a gentler ending than the one he had been running from, and that beneath the burning western sun, fate had woven not a curse, but a story of two wounded souls who chose connection over fear. Even when the cost was everything, Deadwood Crossing lay stretched beneath a hard sky like a town already half forgotten, its buildings leaning inward as if sharing secrets, its streets scarred by wagon ruts and old blood, and for years it had known no law beyond whatever fear happened to ride through on a given day, until one afternoon a lone rider appeared at the edge of the dust, moving slow, almost reluctant, a man shaped by miles and regret, wearing a weathered coat and a badge tucked deep in his still bag as if ashamed of it, and his name was Caleb Rourke, though few still remembered it, and fewer cared, because Deadwood Crossing had learned not to hope. Caleb rode with the stiffness of someone who had healed wrong, his shoulder still troubling him from an old wound, his eyes scanning the town not with curiosity but with the caution of a man who knew exactly how quickly things could turn, and when he dismounted near the abandoned sheriff's office, the saloon doors went quiet, conversations fading as faces turned to measure him, because men in towns like this recognized the look of someone who had once stood for something and lost it. He had not come seeking redemption, at least not by name, but the badge had followed him anyway, heavy as iron even when hidden, because once a man wears the law, it never fully leaves him, and Caleb had worn it proudly once, long ago, before Deadwood Crossing was swallowed by the kind of violence that doesn't make legends, only widows. The failure that haunted him was etched into every step he took, the memory of a night when he had been marshal of another town, a smaller one, quieter, where he had promised safety and delivered chaos instead, when a gang he underestimated rode in faster than his courage could rise, when he hesitated at the wrong moment, and by morning the jail was burned, the streets were stained, and the woman he loved lay cold beneath a sheet, her hand still clutching the star he had dropped in the dust. Since then, Caleb had drifted, trading purpose for distance, believing that if he stayed moving, the past could not catch him. But Deadwood Crossing had a way of calling to broken men, and when the town's elders approached him that evening, their voices tired rather than hopeful, asking him to wear the badge just long enough to stand between them and the war they felt coming, he saw in their eyes the same quiet plea he had failed before, and something inside him tightened. He refused at first, of course, because refusal was easier than risking another loss, because he knew what kind of men ruled the area now, knew the name of the gang circling like wolves, and knew that law, once challenged, must either stand firm or fall hard, and he was not sure he had another fall in him. But that night, alone in the darkened office, dust drifting through broken windows, Caleb unpacked the badge and set it on the desk, the metal dull but intact, and as he stared at it, he realized the truth he had been avoiding, that the ghosts he feared were not waiting for him in Deadwood Crossing. They were already riding with him, and the only way to quiet them was to face what he had once run from. By morning, he pinned the badge to his coat, the weight settling familiar and unwelcome, and the town took notice, because even false hope can feel like light in a place long starved of it. Caleb moved quickly, not with speeches but with action, fixing doors, organizing watches, disarming drunks without spectacle, reminding the people how order feels when it is calm and steady rather than loud, and though some laughed behind his back, others straightened a little, standing taller simply because someone had asked them to. The gang rode in 2 days later, a line of hard faces and easy confidence, expecting surrender, and when they saw Caleb standing alone in the street, they smiled, because they recognized him too, recognized the marshal who had failed once, and they reminded him of it with cruel accuracy, naming the town he lost, naming the woman who died, trying to shake the ground beneath his feet. And for a moment, the old fear surged, sharp as it had ever been, the urge to step aside and let the storm pass, but Caleb did not move, because he finally understood that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to stand anyway. The standoff stretched, the town holding its breath, children peering from behind curtains, hands tightening around tools that might pass for weapons, and when the first shot rang out, not from Caleb, but from one of the gang, reckless and impatient, the world seemed to narrow, and Deadwood Crossing erupted into chaos. Caleb moved with the precision born of hard lessons, not reckless but resolute, calling out orders, positioning townsfolk, using the land and buildings rather than bravado, and though the fight was brutal and unforgiving, it was not the wild slaughter of his memories, because this time he did not hesitate, did not freeze when the moment demanded action, and as the dust settled and the surviving gang members fled, the silence that followed felt different, heavier but cleaner. Caleb stood alone again in the street, bruised and bleeding, his shoulder burning, and for a terrible second he waited for the familiar hollow feeling, the certainty that victory would still taste like ash, but instead there was something else, something quieter, a sense that the story had shifted, just slightly. Deadwood Crossing had not been saved forever, and Caleb knew that better than anyone, but for now, the town stood, and the people looked at him not with awe but with gratitude, which felt more honest. That night, as he removed the badge and set it beside him, Caleb allowed himself to mourn properly for the past he could not change, and in that mourning, he found a measure of peace, because facing his failure had not erased it, but it had loosened its grip, and as dawn broke over Deadwood Crossing, the last marshal sat watching the light touch the rooftops, knowing he might ride on again, but also knowing that wherever he went next, he would carry not just ghosts, but proof that even broken men can stand when it matters most. Deep in Black Canyon, where the rock walls rose like dark sentinels and the sun touched the earth only in narrow, fleeting bands, there lay a hidden vein of gold whispered about in saloons and campfires with equal parts hunger and fear, said to be cursed by the devil himself. And when Jonah Pike found the map, it was not with triumph but with a tired sort of disbelief, because men like Jonah did not stumble upon miracles, they endured them, scraping by from one dry claim to the next, carrying hope like a fragile tool that broke easily and was hard to replace. Jonah was no villain and no hero, just a prospector worn thin by years of dust and disappointment, his face lined early by sun and regret, his hands cracked and steady, and when the map fell from the false bottom of a dead man's still bag outside a forgotten trading post, he stared at it for a long time before touching it, because he had heard the stories of Black Canyon since he was a boy, stories of men who went in laughing and came out broken or not at all, stories of gold that gleamed too brightly and voices that followed you home, and yet the map was real, inked on old paper, marked with signs only someone who knew the land intimately could have drawn, and desperation has a way of making even curses feel negotiable. He told himself he would be careful, that he would take only what he needed, that he would turn back at the first sign of trouble, but the desert has always listened closely to promises made in quiet moments, and it remembers which ones are kept. Jonah set out at dawn, the horizon pale and endless, his mule plodding faithfully beside him, and at first the journey felt ordinary enough, the land unfolding as it always had, silent and vast, but by the second day, the air began to feel different, heavier, as if the canyon ahead was drawing breath, and that night, as Jonah sat by his fire, he heard the first whisper, faint and uncertain, like wind slipping through stone, saying his name as if tasting it, and though he told himself it was only the canyon settling, he slept lightly, dreams tangled with memories of coins slipping through his fingers. The whispers grew clearer as he traveled deeper, not loud or demanding, but patient, offering reassurance, reminding him of debts unpaid, of years lost chasing luck that never stayed, and they spoke with a familiarity that unsettled him, sounding sometimes like his father, who had died broke but hopeful, sometimes like the men he had known who swore they would strike it rich tomorrow, and Jonah found himself answering under his breath, arguing, bargaining, as if the canyon were an old acquaintance who knew too much. When he reached the marked place, a narrow cut in the rock hidden behind a curtain of shadow, the gold revealed itself in thin, shining lines that caught the light and held it, more beautiful than he had imagined, more dangerous for it, and as he chipped away carefully, his heart pounding not with greed but with relief, the voices softened, praising his courage, his persistence, telling him he had earned this reward, that the world owed him at last. Jonah filled his satchel slowly, resisting the urge to take more, reminding himself that enough was enough, but each piece of gold seemed to whisper of what else it could become: security, rest, respect. And when he finally stepped back, the canyon seemed to sigh, as if disappointed but not angry, and he left believing he had outwitted the curse by moderation. The journey home, however, did not unfold as planned. Because the whispers did not fade with distance, they followed him across the desert, growing more insistent, no longer content with suggestion, but asking questions that cut close to the bone, asking what Jonah would do if he lost the gold, who he would be if he returned empty-handed again. And when a sudden storm forced him to shelter beneath an overhang, the voices gathered like a low chorus, promising protection, promising fortune beyond measure, if only he would return and take what was truly his. Jonah's resolve weakened not all at once but in small, human ways, through doubt and fatigue, through the memory of winters spent hungry and summers spent alone. And when the storm passed, he turned back toward Black Canyon, telling himself he would take just a little more, just enough to silence the fear that had followed him all his life. The second time the gold felt different, colder somehow, heavier in his hands, and as he filled his satchel again, the canyon's whispers grew louder, less familiar, shedding borrowed voices for something older and less kind, speaking of balance and debt, of the way the earth keeps account even when men do not. And Jonah felt a tremor of understanding pass through him, the sense that the price was not measured in gold at all. As he climbed out of the canyon with his burden, the land itself seemed to resist him, paths narrowing, shadows stretching long and crooked, and when he stumbled, spilling gold onto the sand, the whispers laughed softly, not in cruelty but in certainty, as if this outcome had always been known. Days blurred together as Jonah wandered, direction slipping away like water through fingers, the voices guiding him one moment and misleading him the next, until he could no longer tell whether he was following them or being driven by them. And in his exhaustion, he spoke aloud, asking what they wanted, what the true price was, and the answer came not as words but as understanding, that the gold demanded more than labor or blood. It demanded devotion, demanded that a man let go of the life he had been living and accept a new one shaped entirely by desire. Jonah thought then of the quiet dreams he had once held, not of riches but of rest, of belonging somewhere, and he realized with a sharp ache that the canyon offered him wealth at the cost of that simple hope. And in that moment of clarity, he did something the whispers did not expect. He opened his satchel and let the gold spill freely into the dust, watching it disappear into the earth as if returning home. The canyon grew silent, the sudden absence of sound ringing louder than any voice, and Jonah felt something lift from his chest, a pressure he had carried so long he had mistaken it for his own heart. He walked away slowly, unafraid now, though the desert remained vast and unforgiving. And when he finally reached the edge of civilization, he arrived with nothing to show for his journey but a deeper understanding of himself. The story of the devil's gold would continue, of course, because stories like that are hard to bury, and men would keep searching Black Canyon with maps and dreams, hearing whispers that promised more than they could safely give. But Jonah Pike never returned, choosing instead a quieter life, one measured not by fortune but by days lived honestly. And if sometimes, on certain nights, the wind carried a faint murmur across the sand, it was not calling him back, only reminding the land that one desperate man had listened closely enough to walk away, leaving the devil's gold to shine unseen beneath the dark canyon walls.